we're moving on from bridges. What we're going to find is that the things that were difficult with bridges, the new concept of figuring out how to put the ineffective flows, where to put the cross-section so that you can tell the 1D engine that, hey, we need to start, there was a bridge upstream, we're expanding away from that, or we're on the other side contracting into it. The good news is that culverts have exactly the same issues. So even though it's complicated, we're going to talk about it maybe in a different way that it was presented earlier. But it is actually one of the key concepts that you're supposed to get out of this class. Thinking about what's actually happening with the 1D engine, how the computations work, and what do we need to do to overcome the deficiencies of that. Like at a particular cross-section just upstream of a bridge, how does it know that there's a bridge or structure just one away, just right there? And well, it knows the influence of that by your ineffective flow placements. And again, what we're going to see with culverts is it's very much the same problem. We're going to talk about culvert hydraulics, and we're going to talk about culvert hydraulics in general, and then how they're done in RAS. We'll look at the solution methodology a bit, and there is one new concept. It's inlet outlet control. So when it does computations through a culvert, it usually does both, and then it takes the higher of the two, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so the region, the influence of the culvert is there's going to be, I guess from downstream to upstream, there'll be what happens downstream, what happens through the culvert, and then what happens upstream of it. Exactly analogous to what happened with bridges. When you go to put in a structure with culverts, you could put in just one culvert. A common thing is to have the same kind of culvert, but then it's a couple of them that are all exactly the same. They just have a different centerline station. Same slope, same area, same end value, that kind of thing. And you can do that, or you can put in multiple non-identical ones, like maybe there were some box culverts or something, and then they added some other ones across at a different time. And we'll see how to input all that data. Here's a view, kind of a plan view, what you might look at. There's a roadway embankment, there might be a sloping thing, and then there might be some interesting things done around the entrance. And the way you describe the interesting things done around the entrance and exit are with the chart and scale number. We'll see that. I guess we'll talk about it here, and Stan will show you that, where you put that in. But these are some drop downs that kind of give you an opportunity to describe how this is different from any other culvert. But in this lecture, we'll talk about how that would affect the equations. Okay, and then in cross-section view, it would look something like so. Okay, here's all the shapes that we can do in RAS. And if you kind of look through those, I would ask the class, does anything there kind of stand out?
There's only one that's a box or rectangular shape. All the others are some type of like.
Okay, that's true. All of them are made out of arcs, except for one, the box one. That's not what I'm getting at. So what I'm getting at is if you look at the names of them, they all look like things that the shape you might have learned. But conspan. What about that shape? It's made out of 5 arcs. So there's a large arc, goes across the top. There's a radius of curvature here, then another one to kind of smoothly transition those. So when you were in kindergarten and they were talking about drawing circles with protractors or whatever, the conspan came up? Well, no. Okay, conspan is the name of a company. And they did something that we liked, and they asked us to include that shape in RAS. And what did they do that we liked? They made an open bottom culvert. And if you're worried about fish making it through a structure, we like that. We like to have a natural bottom all the way through, if you can do that. It's more expensive, and if you're only worried about having the road cross a creek and have the road not get washed away, then you might not be worried about that. But then if people are worried about, hey, this used to be a great place to fish, but you cut it off. Okay, so the conspan shape it's a company, and they did something that no one else has done yet, but we would encourage any company to do this, is that they came up with the new shape, and then they actually went and did the lab research work necessary to come up with the regression of coefficients that we use to solve the equations here. And I'll point those out. Anyways, these are all shapes. So circle, most culverts are circular. Then we start hitting problems where you don't have enough room. Then you start looking at, well, I guess circular and box are super common. But then these other ones come into play when you don't have enough room or whatever. And I guess another thing that people like about conspan culverts is that they are pre-constructed concrete things. And most of them can fit on a regular flatbed truck. They make really big ones. So DOTs like it, that kind of thing, because they can pour the piers, the foundation on both sides, and then bring it in a crane, drop it in, and then traffic can go by days later. Where in these other ones, there's a lot of compaction that has to be done to ensure their integrity. We did this a long time ago. I hope they're still in existence. I haven't looked at this for a long time. Well, a bunch of them were made, so we can still model them. Okay, so cross-section locations. When bridges, we called it a 6 cross-section bridge model, but we had it labeled the same way. We had one cross-section downstream, that is flowing. It doesn't really feel the effect of the culvert at all, in the sense that all the flow lines are kind of going parallel with the, all going directly downstream. Cross-section 2, just downstream of the structure, this is where they're just coming out of the culvert, they're still constricted, and then they're going to be expanding towards cross-section 1. Then in the bridge lecture, we talked about BD and BU, and here we'll talk about culvert up and culvert down. So that's the constraint going through the structure. Then 3 is the one just upstream of the structure, which is constrained by the structure itself. And then 4, some distance upstream, where all the flow lines are kind of going parallel with the river. Then they're going to start to contract and go through the opening, and then expand on the way out. Okay, so how does that affect our modeling? Well, we think about where to place these cross sections, and we talked about that with the bridges. But the most important thing about that is I need to control the contraction and expansion via ineffective flow regions. So that concept of bridges plays out exactly here, and we'll talk about it more in the next few minutes. Okay, so cross-section 1. Yes?
One of the things that I mean, and you kind of glossed over this before, too, with bridges, but when you say just upstream, we're talking, like, are there any guidelines for how far that is?
More in the 5 feet range. At the toe of the embankment, and just right exactly at the toe, or just a few feet away from that. And if it's vertical, vertical embankment or something, then at 5 feet, a couple feet. Or if you're trying to come up with something that works over a huge range of problems, something like a small ratio of how big the culvert is. So if the culvert is 10 feet wide, then a couple of feet's fine. If the culvert is hundreds of feet wide, then maybe 10, 20 feet would be fine. Yeah.
Just looking for a rough idea.
It's close range. Okay, so again, downstream, this is where the entire cross section is effective, where all the flow lines are going directly downstream. We're not going to artificially constrain it with these ineffective regions. Okay, cross-section 2, this is the one just downstream of the bridge. So that would be that one. Flow's going this direction, and we're going to be expanding coming out of it. And we're going to put ineffective flows that are at the right spacing, like an expansion ratio of maybe 2 to 1. And we found that 2 to 1 works over a wide range of problems. There are regression equations that were talked about in the last lecture that try to refine that. But when we did a bunch of studies, 2 to 1 is a very good opening offer. Okay, then here we are. This is the one just downstream. And it's tempting to think about this structure picture here as if you were downstream, turn around looking up at it. But that's not actually the orientation. Remember I said the orientation for RAS is going downstream. So this is actually the one just on the downstream side, as if you were seeing through the bridge, or seeing through the structure. And the same thing is true on bridges. So this is upstream view looking downstream at the back end of the culvert opening. And the kind of things that you would see if you're toggling between sections you're looking at is that the ineffectives are probably a little bit closer together on the downstream side because it's expanding less fast than it contracts. So this ratio here, this is more gradual than the upstream side. This is a 1 to 1 region. This is usually 2 to 1. Okay. Cross-section 3 and upstream side. So that's this one, and it will have ineffectives there. And the placement of them, left and right, that has to do with the the contraction and expansion ratios we were talking about. Again, upstream side, kind of 1 to 1-ish. Downstream side, 2 to 1. What about the elevations? So that's all talk about left and right. But what about elevations? Well, the elevations are what they need to be to achieve what you want. And what do you want? Well, when water's going through the culvert, we want it to contract and go through. So you set them at an elevation, and you could set them really high if the culvert never gets overtopped. If the roadway never gets overtopped, then that would be fine. But what happens if the roadway does get overtopped? Well, then there's not going to be a recirculating pool over here, right? The water's going to go over the whole structure, and there won't be a recirculating pool here or down here. That will be effective. Okay, so you're going to go and put the elevations to make that happen. And how do you make that happen? Well, the same way we talked about with bridges. On the upstream side, it's easy. Just put them exactly at the elevation of the deck. On the downstream side, you can start with that, but sometimes water can go over and dip. Kind of depends how far away that you were talking about. That if this cross-section here is further away, that's more of an opportunity for there to be a dip in the water surface. So that's another incentive to have it kind of close, because then the elevations will be similar to the top of the bridge deck. Usually we put them a little bit lower. And how do you know you have it right? Is you run your simulation and look to see if everything triggers on and off in an orchestrated manner. Meaning, and what do I mean by orchestrated? That if water goes over this bridge deck and this one turns off, but this one stays on, well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? But unfortunately, the 1D engine doesn't tell you anything about that. That's up to you to figure that out. Everybody follow that? This is a good concept here, that if water goes over this bridge deck and this ineffective right here, or this one right here is set such that it triggers off, that would be good. But you put this one too high and it didn't turn off. That would be bad, because you'd be saying water goes over here and then it ends up in this ineffective area. So again, the 1D computation methodology, every cross-section, it doesn't know anything about what's happening above and below it. That is all up to you to figure that out and make it behave like the way you want it to. Okay, so cross-section 4. That's this one upstream here. It's upstream far enough where it has not begun to contract. This distance is normally determined using a 1-to-1 contraction ratio. The entire cross-section is considered to be conveying flow. Bridge modeling guidelines, they can be used to help locate that. Okay, so again, it is not so much as where the cross-sections are, it's about where the ineffectives are. It's nice if you just put this one at this distance, that far upstream, that's 1-to-1, then it doesn't need to have ineffective flows. But if you had another one in the middle, or many, don't have many colors here, but let's say we had 10 cross-sections in here, and I'm not going to draw 10 lines. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. What would you need to do? You would need to put ineffectives on all of them to achieve that by telling the 1D engine to contract the flow in that opening. And the same thing is true on the downstream side. When the bridge is centered, it's easy to think about, well, I'll go this distance upstream, and that's the same as over here. But what if this bridge was like way over here? Well, then you can't do that, right? Then you're going to end up needing to draw those lines and think about where to put those ineffectives on your own. Okay, so as with bridges, you need to increase the contraction and expansion coefficient. So the contraction expansion coefficient for gradual transitions, the 0.1 and 0.3, it's kind of remarkable how well that works. There's like fundamental processes in nature that encourage that gradual transitions are the norm as opposed to abrupt, or because there's higher velocities around abrupt things and they tend to get worn down over time, which is why we need maintenance on structures, because we are constricting the flow, getting higher velocities, we get a scour around them and things like that. Okay, so this works out really well in almost every cross-section, every natural cross-section. It doesn't work out well near man-made structures, so we need to bump them up. And 0.3 and 0.5 are pretty good numbers. Oh, where do you apply them? You apply them in cross-sections 2, 3, and 4. So that's this one, and this one. So when I attach those properties to those locations, where's it actually applying it? It's applying it on the losses. So if I bump up the contraction loss on 4, then when it does a calculation between these two cross sections, that's actually where it applies that loss. So the parameter's attached to the upstream cross section, but it's going to affect the loss between the one downstream and that one. So you could say, well, on the upstream side, I understand I need to increase my contraction loss from 0.1 to 0.3. So I could put a 0.3 there, but then you're also telling me to change the expansion to 0.5. Clearly it's contracting, right? Okay, that is absolutely true. It's also true that on the downstream side, when you went from 2 to 1 down here, you could say, well, on the downstream side, the contraction doesn't matter. I'm really clever. I'll use 0.3 on the upstream side and 0.5 on the downstream side. And you would be absolutely right, and you will have to fight this with everybody who looks at your model from there on out. Because they will go, no, we do 0.3 and 0.5 on the upstream and downstream. I didn't write these rules, but these are what we live by. And if you have a data checker, like FEMA has some protocol and stuff like that, they will look line item to see if you've done this. And they're good numbers. Works in a wide range of conditions. So anyway, put them at 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, so the abrupt transition to 0.6 and 0.8, yeah, no, I've not used that in any real world case at all.
I have a question. Why would you set the expansion and contraction coefficients on cross-section number 4 and not just 2 and 3?
Yeah, okay, that's right. But contraction expansion happens over a distance, and that distance is from here to here. So when you put them in cross-section 4, it's applying it on this range. When you put them in 3, it's going to apply it in this range. When you put them in at 2, it's going to apply them at this range.
So, and you wouldn't put it at 1 because then it would apply it to the...
That's exactly right. That's the key point on that. Let me say it again. So, or reiterate what you just said, is that if you put them in at 1, that would be saying that the increased contraction expansion losses would be applying between 1 and whatever was downstream from it. And we're saying 1 is where the flow lines are all going downstream and there is no more expanding to be done. Oh, if it's very sinuous? No, even then I would not. If the channel is sinuous because of natural processes, geomorphology or something, then that's probably actually gradual then. So limitations for how we put culverts in RAS is the cross-sectional area needs the same. So essentially, it's a single shape, it's got to keep going. The same bottom slope, the same roughness. Well, you can put in 2 roughness values, one for the bottom, one for the top, but it's fixed all the way through. If you have a corrugated metal pipe, sometimes they put asphalt on the bottom third of them or something to keep them from rusting out. But you got to do that everywhere. And the flow is going to be consistent, so whatever comes in one end is going to make its way out eventually. You can't have any like inlet drain or something like that. You can't have another source of inflow into a culvert partway through. If you're worried about that, then you're probably not in the right lecture. Then that you're worried more about a pipe flow system, and we're working on that. Lectures to come. Again, you can have same in value for the top and bottom. And that's also good for natural bottom culverts. That you could have a concrete top and then a 0.025 or 0.03 for the natural bottom. So some terminology, pretty straightforward. If it's a circle, we talk about the diameter. And then if it's not circular, then we talk about it in terms of rise and span. So there's the rise, and the rise is from lowest to highest, and the span is from widest to, how wide could it possibly be? That's just the terms we use. There's one little point on this plot that I would like to point out, and that is it's got little chamfered corners on the end of it. And that represents a very small area. I would still consider that this is still a box culvert. Don't worry about those little corners at the end. Here's some more terminology and a red line with a note that has 3 exclamation points. And what it says is that this thing that goes from the ground up to the dotted line is the energy grade line. We're going to call that the headwater for the purpose of culvert terminology. Kind of wish they hadn't done that, but here we are. So it says headwaters to the energy grade line. And this is the same thing that happened with Weir flow too. When you see something in the equations or diagrams talks about headwater, then that's what that's talking about. What are the things of interest? So here's our cross-section 3, the one just upstream. We're going to contract and go into the entrance of the culvert. That's the entrance region. Then there's going to be barrel length, what happens inside the barrel, and then exit. And so the losses that happen through a culvert are going to be those 3 different parts, and we'll talk about those in detail. The head loss is going to be entrance loss, friction loss through the barrel, and then exit loss. The energy head up here, the v squared over 2g on the upstream part of the inlet, that's the term we're going to, in Act 4, that commits the crime or something, the gun that was on the wall or something, I don't know, the knife on the board in the library. Okay, the v squared and 2g on the entrance, that's going to be important later. Okay, so I mentioned that there is 2 different ways we compute losses through culverts, and the 2 methodologies are outlet control and inlet control. And we'll talk about both of these a little bit more in detail. Outlet control, we're going to find, is very much like just the standard step energy approach. You're looking at contractions, expansions, and then friction losses within values. That's outlet control. Another potential, though, is what happens if the inlet is so constrained that the capacity of the barrel can't be met. So there's another possibility that can happen at a culvert, is that the inlet can be constructed such that it actually controls what happens. So we're going to have a different equation to see if that actually happened. In that situation, what affects the upstream answer? The headwater elevation will be controlled by the inlet area, inlet configuration, and barrel shape. But things like barrel roughness, barrel area, and barrel length, those are all, and it seems like barrel slope should be not checked there too, but we'll talk about why that is. All this stuff is like what happens kind of downstream. So when I start making statements like it doesn't matter what happens downstream, where's another place when that comes up? So that we talked about the concept of critical depth. So that's actually what's happening here, is that we're asking, oh, did critical depth happen at the upstream side? And then a corollary to that is like, oh, okay, good if it did, because nothing downstream matters if it goes through critical depth. Turns out if the water gets high enough downstream, then it won't go through critical depth, so that does matter. But that's the concept here, is that we're going to do inlet calculations, and they're only going to be concerned about whether or not we could get the water into the pipe at that elevation with that amount of available energy. Okay, let's jump into that. What we end up doing is we compute both, and the inlet solution might look something like this, and the outlet control one might look something like this, and then we take the higher of the two. And in most culverts, in most situations, the outlet control answer is actually higher than the inlet control. So the inlet one, it still has that shape, but it's just down low, or the flows that we run through it, we never even see this. Okay, so at some point, the Weir flow is gonna happen, and then that'll take over. Well, I mean, there'll still be flow through the culvert, but we'll end up with a combined curve that will look something more like this thicker one right there. Okay, so when does inlet control? Inlet control happens when the capacity of the entrance is less than the capacity of the barrel. It's gonna happen just on the upstream side of the entrance of the culvert. Water's gonna pass through critical depth, and then we're gonna have a little period of maybe all the way, or maybe just a short period of supercritical flow. And then we're gonna go into another type of equation, which are more like sluice gates or Weir type equation. Inlet capacity depends on entrance geometry. Okay, so what might that look like in profile is that we're gonna go through critical depth somewhere, and maybe it persists all the way through. Maybe there's a hydraulic jump, and it could be downstream like it's happening there, or it could be inside the culvert, and RAS can do all that. On the top one is where it comes in and is not pressured at any point, but it could actually be a submerged inlet here, and then go through critical depth and then persist all the way through. In this last case, this is possible that you could have a submerged inlet and a submerged outlet, and it could go through supercritical flow here, have a supercritical profile, and then jump somewhere in the middle of the pipe. And this diagram it says a median drain right there. Do you know why? None of these other plots have that. Do you know why that plot has that? It's because if you wanted to actually set up a lab or make something that would actually have this happen over time and persist, then you would actually have to have a new air supply down into this pocket. Because if you think about what does hydraulic jump look like? It's very turbulent, right? So what happens is the air would get entrained in this mess and get washed out, and all the air would get sucked out of that. So if you wanted to set up a system where you had a hydraulic jump that persisted through a culvert, you would have to have some way to get air in the middle of it. Okay, so most culverts don't have that, and we didn't want to add the option to do that, so when you end up with submerged outlet like that and a submerged inlet like this, we just say it's going to flow full. And for the most part, it doesn't really matter. If you were going to swim through it, that would matter a lot. But if you're short of that, it doesn't really matter much. We go to full flow on that one. Okay, so we used to solve this with something called the nomograph, which is maybe time to drop this slide because we're not remotely doing things with this anymore. But when you're doing things by hand, this is how this would be done. Okay, how do we do it now? Well, we use the equations that went into making that kind of graphical solution. And we're going to do these inlet control equations. So these are regression equations that were developed through an enormous number of studies done by the Federal Highway, I think, years ago. And the same ones that were done by Conspan not that long ago. Okay, so they're all set up this way. In the unsubmerged inlet and the submerged inlet, they are set up in ratios of headwater over diameter. And they are a function of flow, area, depths, and they have regression parameters of M, K, C, and Y. Y is not a depth. Y is another regression parameter. Earlier on that plot, or on that chart, I said where slope come into play? Seems like it shouldn't. Well, it goes in right there. And I think that has to do with if you have a culvert and it's so steep enough that the angle of the entrance starts to affect that, well, that's like a weak function in this term, and they bring it in over there. So that is why there was that X in that slide a while ago. This is slope. For the submerged inlet, this is actually the better solution, but not all of the shapes have this one. So some of the shapes only have this one. So depending on what we have, we use this one if we have it, otherwise use that one. Then another thought on this is that when you gradually go from submerged inlet to unsubmerged inlet, if you look at the numbers, well, you'd have to go figure out what K and M are, you will find that this equation does not gradually transition into that equation. And what we do there, in all these situations, when we have one domain to go to another domain, is we linearly transition from one submergence to another. That is something that we do during calculations. Outlet control, this is the vanilla case, where we're going to solve it using essentially vanilla energy type equations we've been using all week, and will continue to do so. Occurs when the flow capacity is limited by downstream conditions. So that's the backwater condition. Downstream is, I'm computing one cross-section to another, kind of marching upstream. Backwater flow. Flow is subcritical. Flow is computed an energy balance from downstream cross-section 2 to the upstream cross-section 3. So our culvert hydraulics are going to be what happens between here and here. And we're going to break that down into 3 parts, entrance, friction, and exit loss. are computed, and we'll see how each one of those is done. This is what the various scenarios look like. Here's the one where it's full flow. It's submerged in both headwater and tailwater, full flow. And that one requires really simple calculations because we compute one injury loss for the whole length of the culvert, wherein in this one, we're actually going to do a profile through it. So we're doing standard step. We step back this way. We're doing standard steps downstream. We could do this cross section, and we do our exit loss calculation. We get to that point, and then we could do standard steps all the way through. Turns out we don't. We do something called a direct step, which is same equation, but instead you solve for distance rather than head loss, and it's faster. You might remember that direct step from when you took hydraulics as undergrad. And this is the only place we apply it, is right in here. Because we have a prismatic channel, we know what the shape is, and that's one of the requirements to use that method. Okay, then we get out here, then we do another entrance calculation to figure out what the headwater is going to be upstream. Here is a kind of a flowchart diagram. This is way back when, the books that we sent, and then it was the PDFs that we sent, and now it's the web page that you can find. And it has this diagram in it, and it gives you an indication like why culvert hydraulics are complicated. Each one of the diamonds is a question to put you in a different part of it, and then each one of the blocks is like a full, well, it could be a complicated calculation or it could be relatively trivial. So let's look at some of them. So is culvert slope 0? So why would that be important? So I think actually it's actually set in the actual calculation. It says, is the culvert slope greater than 0? If it's greater than 0, then we head down this way and we can compute normal depth. If it's adverse or 0, then you can't compute normal depth. So those are the kind of algorithm checks that has to happen when you're doing culvert hydraulics. Outlet control headwater. So how do we go from cross section 2 to cross section 3? And this is all just the term for the Bernoulli energy in cross section 2, Bernoulli energy in cross section 3, the difference being the head loss. And all the terms are described there. They're the same as they are at any cross sections. Vanilla, Bernoulli energy, each of them. So how are we going to compute H sub L? And we're going to do it in 3 parts. We're going to explicitly talk about how to do the entrance, and then we'll talk about how to do the friction and how to do the exit. So when we do standard step, we do friction and contraction and expansion between every one. When we do culverts, we don't do that. This is expansion 1. This is a contraction 1. And then the friction 1, every little direct step along the way, we don't do contraction expansion losses. It's all just about losses through friction with Manning's equation. Parenthetically here, we've got the entrance loss coefficient. It's the coefficient of the entrance times the velocity at the inlet. And then the exit loss is a coefficient times the velocity of the outlet minus the velocity across section 2. And you're just going to go along here, but there might be some point where you go, wait, what? The wait, what moment is this one? It is that this one says take a difference in velocity head and multiply it times something. That's what we always do. It's like, well, did it speed up or slow down? That's what matters. And then you multiply that times a number, and that's fair, right? That's a force. You change the velocity. This one is not like that. This one says, well, how fast was it going? I'm going to multiply, I'll take the energy from that and just subtract it. It's mostly the only difference between if you just set up standard steps and did energy equations all the way through, then you would naturally do something more like this. You would say, what's the velocity head downstream? What's it upstream? Did it speed up or slow down? Then I will multiply times coefficient of contraction, expansion. This one just says, well, how fast is it moving? And I'm gonna multiply that times that coefficient. Okay, so most of the time that doesn't matter at all, but there's a few cases where that matters, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. Okay, so from cross section 2 up into the culvert, we're going to compute expansion. Yeah, the exit loss one, it takes a coefficient, takes a difference of velocity head, just like a regular expansion coefficient, and the default is 1. So when we were talking about the bridges, that whole discussion we had earlier about contraction expansion cross sections, this is like saying that the expansion one is 1. What does that mean? That means that the entire velocity head, when it exited, was lost due to its spreading out. So if the culvert goes into a pond downstream, then 1 is fine. If it still stays in the channel, then maybe something less than 1 is a good idea. So the culvert hydraulics were largely set up having an embankment between 2 pools of water, running flow between them. And in that case, the downstream was a steady pool, so all the velocity head went away. But it is based on a difference in velocity head, so this is not as crucial as on the other end of it, which we'll see here in a bit. So this is a standard normal step kind of approach to the head loss. Okay, what happens when we're going through? If it is flowing full, we just do this one equation, where it looks like all the stuff in Manning's equation, because it is. It's just kind of rearranged to solve for head loss, and we do that one thing, and then we have the friction loss through the whole barrel. If it's not that, we do a kind of a step through the culvert, but instead of being the standard step one, we use this other one called direct step, just because it's faster and we can. Because the requirements for this direct step methodology is that it has to be prismatic. If everything you ever did was on trapezoidal concrete channels that never got bigger or smaller, then you could do this too. But hopefully we're not doing a lot of that anymore. Okay, on the other side, entrance loss is computed as the entrance loss coefficient times the absolute velocity head, and maybe that should be like bold or underlined or something like that. That we're just gonna take a coefficient, take the velocity head and multiply that number, and then it's gone. Okay, that's fine. Almost all cases. Where is this not fine? So say we were working on the Rio Hondo River in Southern California, which is a concrete rectangle, and it goes really fast. It's one of those ones you've seen on TV, like a trailer gets in there, goes down, hits a bridge, and just implodes and goes through, exciting videos. Anyways, there are structures on that look like, well, it looks like a culvert. It's a box culvert, right? But this is where this term bites you, is that it's got all the factors to make this terrible. Is that it's got a really high velocity, and there's no contraction expansion. The channel, that's on order of like 100 feet wide, I can't remember. But the culvert box opening is also 100 feet wide. So there is no contraction. On the other end of it, there is no expansion. And if all the terms are done with differences in velocity head, then that's great. But this one particular thing right here, that's when it bites you, is that it says, well, the water's moving really fast down there. It's a concrete channel. It's designed to go at like 20 feet per second or something. Well, that velocity head's pretty big. And then you ended up multiplying it by 0.5. And so you predict a huge loss that is not real. Okay, so just letting you know that the culvert methodology was set up to work over a wide range of problems, but this one particular quirk about it makes it so that you can't apply it in those cases. Or in the cases where the culvert is not really a culvert, it's still exactly the same size as the channel upstream and downstream. In those situations, what should you do? Well, you could go set the entrance loss coefficient to 0. That would work. Or you can model as a bridge. Because then with the energy calculations we go through bridges, again, they're very much just like this. A minor but important takeaway from the culvert lecture is just that. Okay, entrance efficiency. This can actually be deceiving, how important it is to do a little bit of rounding on the upstream end. So here's a culvert barrel, water's going that way, and if you have a little bit of rounding, the rounding is actually not very much. It is way better hydraulically than, in some situations, than having an abrupt corner. You can make it an inlet control situation by having an abrupt edge like that. So what do you do about that? Is when you're speccing to build a culvert, just put a little bit of curvature on the end of it. Don't have it be a sharp edge. When culverts are precast, and one's got kind of a bell end, the other side just fits into that, so they stack them together. If you put the bell end on the upstream side, that is way better hydraulically, because that ends up being more mimicking this than having the other end on the upstream side. If you're outlet control, then that doesn't matter, but you don't know that always, so it's really worthwhile to put a little bit of curvature on the upstream side. Okay, so where do you get these coefficients? Tables. And our help system has these tables, and there's others that you can find on the web. And so here we're looking at culverts that all those coefficients, there's ones for end values, there's one for through culverts, there's one for the coefficient of entrance, there's one for exit, and then there's a chart and scale, which are another way to describe what's happening, and Sam will talk about that later. Other little speed up things you can do in culverts is if you know the shape, particularly if it's rectangular, then you can use this equation to compute critical depth faster. When you know the shape of things and it's not a natural channel, there's a bunch of things you can do to speed it up, and we use those when we can. Okay, another caveat is we can handle culvert hydraulics when it's adverse or zero slope. Just in that flow chart, there's some things that happen in there because you can't compute normal depth. That's one of the checks, is you're seeing whether you're above or below normal depth. Okay, so what happens when it gets high enough that it starts going over the weir, over the top of the roadway? Well, then we start computing weir calculation, and the methodology is we first try to put everything through the culvert opening. We look to see what headwater we get and go to the deck and say, oh, is that below? If it's below, we're done. If it's above, then then some water might be going over. You start balancing water going over versus water going through to get an upstream energy that matches. The same thing we do with bridges. We can do mixed flow, meaning that there could be a supercritical through. And what we do here, this little list of steps, perform a backwater subcritical, do that first. If you find critical depth is reached or you're near, then we'll do a supercritical pass-through. We compute specific force at each location, and then we take the higher of the two. Okay, so this is what we do inside culverts, and this is also exactly what we do for cross-sections. If you have a series of cross-sections and some of them go supercritical and some of them are subcritical, this is exactly the same procedure. Not by accident, it's a good procedure.